Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at the process for choosing the best possible response for when you answer any kind of question. And we're going to go through this by basically a practice-based exercise. And we're going to look at a very, very broad question in order to do it. So let's just basically look at the process of choosing the best response first. We're going to basically look at, as I said, a broad question, but we're also going to look at one that is often poorly done. Now, the reason why broad questions are often poorly done is actually remarkably quite simple. It's because most people, when they see a very broad and very simple question, they give it a very simple and very stupid answer. And essentially, it comes down to students going, oh my God, this is easy. I've got a million answers for this. Problem is that when you're doing this in English, one of the things you need to do is be able to show that you can refine your responses and do so in such a way where you actually construct something. Construct an argument, construct a line of reasoning. You don't just sort of list all the things that come to mind. And certainly you could do that. But the problem is you're not really creating an answer, as in a whole heap of different ideas and thoughts, which is sort of somewhat centered around a question. And that doesn't really answer it. So we're going to go through the process of constructing an argument and doing so in a way that not only answers the broad question, but is not only specific, but also covers most of it, if not all of it. We're also going to look at basically other sorts of things, like why this is basically the process of not choosing the best response and what causes essentially these sorts of problems. The reasons why these are often poorly executed, which is what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so this is our broad question. Why is change necessary for humanity to thrive? It's a very big question. It has many, many possible answers. If you have a look at that picture, it's just like that. As many answers as there are stars in the sky, that sort of thing. So, if no answer can be wrong, that means field day, right? Well, sort of. You need to be very careful with this. We want to focus on establishing a clear argument before we look at basically adding anything to back it up. Which means usually, and this is the chronic problem that often comes in, especially one that I think creeps in from primary school, is that a lot of students will list a whole heap of examples about why change is necessary. And they'll list all the things that have changed which have allowed us to thrive, which is all well and good. But they're only small examples on a much larger scale. And we want to be covering a much larger scale, not the tiny little examples that just form a small part of it. It's like saying how the pyramids were built by basically only going up to the first row and not covering the rest of it. So that's what we're going to look at. At this stage as well, we're not going to use or look at examples or evidence because we're constructing an argument first. And we need to choose the best one before we even think about adding these things. And that's the point of actually picking the best response, is picking one where not only do you get, I guess, the best line of argument, but the one that best suits our examples or evidence. And that requires a very conscious choice. So you need to think about quite carefully about which one is the best. And then find out examples or evidence that will support that, rather than one that will support anything. Alright, so possible answers for this. To start with, humanity and change are very, very broad terms. So we need to look at those. We need to look at converting them in such a way where we can actually use them. But first, let's think about all of the things that may come to mind, all those small little points, which may come to mind when we think of this question. It could include analysis based on society, the self, culture, communities, religious values, technology, politics, welfare, friendships, relationships, child rearing, education, war, human rights, and so on. That's only just the tip of the iceberg. That's what I could come up with in about 2 minutes. I'm sure if I had time, I could probably come up with a lot more. So, it's infinite. It's a huge, huge range, as we went through before. And this is fairly broad categories. I mean, they're not really talking about anything specific. And yet, we can still group these together. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to do it in basically a process like a funnel. So, what I mean by that is we start very big, and then we work our way down gradually. Let me show you how this works. So we're going to start by going to about the middle part of this. and narrowing it down to 5 possible choices. Why do people thrive? So let's ask ourselves that question first. And let's just think very broadly about it. First of all, ideas and technologies can be shared among us. And that allows us to thrive. Yep, that's an answer. We value human life. That's something we do now. It's something I think humans have always done to some extent, but something probably more so now than before. This is not to say this covers the entire world, but we can say as a population, as a generalization, we can say these things. Now, in this case, because we have such a broad question, generalizations are fine to an extent. They're fine to help you form your answer. But once you get to your answer, you need to make them a little bit more specific. And we'll get through this. We value peace and harmony. We find better ways to do things. And finally, we have civilization. We have something now which we call civilization. That basically, through our change as humans, through everything that we've done since our dawn of time, we've been able to basically promote these sorts of values, and that has allowed us to thrive to a population of over 7 billion today. Is by sharing technologies, valuing our lives, finding peace and harmony so we're not all killing each other, finding better ways to do things so we live more comfortable, peaceful, and often more hygienic existences. And we have civilization, cities, things that allow us to grow and nurture ourselves to such an extent that not only do we survive, but we thrive. We go much further than just surviving. So, when we're putting our response together, we've got those 5 things. We've got all those 5 things that that basically can change or changes from humanity, which have brought us benefits, that have allowed us to thrive. And yet that's still too many. We've still got to cut them down. We can't include all of them in their current form. So what we need to do is we need to choose the best of those and join the others where we can, as in put them under a bit of an umbrella. This gives us something that basically can be utilized, something that we can build upon, and something that allows us to expand our explanation. Now, those things were fairly broad to start with, but we can make them even broader to cover a bit more, and that means we can go into depth when we do this. If we try to cover all 5, unless you've got a 100,000 word thesis, you're not going to go into depth on those things. You're not going to cover them with any real great analysis or quality, which is why you start with broad and then you just focus on specifics and, generally speaking, what has given us those things. Giving an answer which allows you to basically communicate more clearly and to look at it in terms of the bigger picture rather than, as I mentioned before, the much smaller one. So, first thing we need to do before we do any of that is we need to rephrase the question. We need to rephrase it, and in terms of also adding our implied meanings. And this will help us in terms of actually choosing what our main arguments are going to be. And especially as the words changing humanity are quite broad, we need to simplify them to such a point where we can essentially skew them our own direction when we talk about our argument. So, in other words, instead of making making change in humanity these big, all-encompassing terms, which cover lots and lots of things, we're going to say what it really does focus on. So, by linking them as well, it allows us to answer both at the same time, and then to split them up into separate arguments. So, not only do the 2 things work together, but they also work as one. And if we're looking at our funnel before, that basically going down, we're right at the bottom now. We've got down to almost 1. But we're going to split up to 2 for the sake of being able to develop them. So we've got 2 main arguments, but we can link them together. So we can show that we've linked them and we can pretty much point them straight back to the question. And this is our simplified definition. Humanity thrives because change allows civilization to evolve, and change in values allow it to be unified. In other words, the changes in civilization means that through our technology, our accomplishments, our buildings, our systems, we're able to thrive. And the same as with our values, the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we act. Our changes in values allow us to stop throwing distinctions between each other, to stop things such as racism, gender differences, and so on. It allows it to be multicultural. which may be your main point for this. All of those things. So these things have basically allowed us to have a state where humanity can thrive. Now, we're not talking, again, as I said, you may say, oh, well, what about countries in the world at the moment that don't necessarily do these things? And there are examples that don't. But the thing is, as a generalization, we can say that this is the direction the world's moving in, that we've got those two things working for us. And we've also now done it in a way that we've rephrased the question. That basically humanity thrives because of change in two areas, civilization and values. And that becomes our key arguments. So with our new rephrasing, we have taken all our ideas, we've chosen the best two, and we have those two arguments. That is, civilization can evolve, and we took that by combining a number of our points before, particularly the one about civilization, but also about some of the things about technology and things being shared, all those sorts of things. By evolving, basically, we're encompassing all those other ideas. And by saying it can be unified by values, again, we can take those overlaps, things that do combine with each other. Now, these two things are also linked together, because you could say that civilization has evolved because values have been unified, and unification of values has allowed civilization to evolve, and vice versa, basically. So you can link those two things together, but for the sake of the argument, help to sort of break it up a little bit, we'll have them as two distinct things, which are linked, which can again go straight back to the question. So everything we're now doing goes straight back to the question. And seeing as we've specified these, and we've chosen our best response out of all those infinite amount of responses, we can now focus on developing it in such a way where we can actually add strength, we can add depth to it, we can discuss it, we can find evidence which is relevant to it, we can find evidence that's relevant to more than just one group. So then we're not going to be talking about people in Sydney, Australia. We're going to be talking about people encompassing most of the world. Now, as I said, you're not going to cover everyone, but you're going to cover a fairly greater number than if you're just to go for examples. And if you're saying, well, the ancient Egyptians showed this because blah, blah, blah. They built pyramids. That means that humanity has thrived. Well, that means that humanity thrived 5,000 years ago. Doesn't necessarily mean the case today. So by choosing these, we can now choose better examples. We can now match what our modern civilization is, our modern humanity, all those things. And it makes it much simpler. So all of our previous ideas have now gone together. They've gone to two. We can better elaborate on each. We can put them all together, think about proving them, which is the second part. Now that we've got our argument set out, and we have a very clear line of argument now, we can think about where we're going to get our evidence from, and think about where we're going to research our evidence. And we can also focus on basically the process of finding the appropriate evidence. Now, evidence and research will also be a part of this process. Now, we haven't really referred to it in this point because what I was mainly focusing on to start with, and what you'll be mainly focusing on to start with, is just basically having a line of argument together. But the important thing is to still do research as well alongside it. Don't inform everything based on research. In other words, don't just copy and paste large sections of text and go, yeah, that's my research, that's my idea, because it's someone else's idea. It's plagiarism, basically. But if you use your evidence gathering in the process, and you do it basically alongside it without influencing what your response is going to be, then you're pretty much being able to distinguish the two, and you're also allowing yourself to construct the main argument. So it's very important to sort of see those two distinctions, that your argument is constructed independent of any evidence, but yet you still use some evidence to help to clarify things, to make it a bit clearer. And you can pretty much do that after you've constructed your main argument. If you see some evidence that contradicts something that you may have said or makes it a little bit murkier, then it's time to change that idea. And you can do that. That's why choosing the arguments to start with is so helpful, because you can actually then use your evidence and use the things that basically informed your response to help change it a little bit and then make it more relevant. So don't attach any of it to your response basically until you work out what your argument is. So now that we know that it's about civilization evolving and changes in values, we can find evidence which suggests that civilization has evolved and that we have changed our values, rather than picking examples, for instance, the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. That doesn't show we've evolved, but we can find probably a more modern example that shows that we have. So there we go, we've got better evidence now. It means we can also choose the best and most appropriate. So as I mentioned before, not only do they match those lines, but they allow us to prove whatever it is that we choose to write. And that's pretty much the basis of everything that you're trying to do through your research, first of all, but also through your arguments and through developing all of the main points that you do. So essentially what you're doing is you're coming up with essentially a path first, and then you're paving it with your evidence. So you're setting up what you want to do, and then you're using this to back it up, to make it stable, to make it supporting, to prove everything that you've done. And that's ultimately what a question is asking you to do, is asking you to provide an answer with proof. You need to create the answer first. You need to create your discussion and your main argument. There's your answer. Your evidence is your proof that backs it up, that supports it, that makes sure that whoever says anything about it will basically have to eat their words because you've proven it. Now, even though that means that, yes, their opinion could be right as well, they have to find proof that matches their argument just the same as you have to find evidence that matches your argument. And then it's up for someone else to decide which one is better. Now, in terms of English, there is no competition with anyone else. So the only one you have to impress is your marker. And by doing this, that's exactly what you'll be doing. So have a look again. Basically, focus on constructing your argument first, making sure you do that, choosing your best response, choosing the broadest and most encompassing response, and then being specific with the way you're discussing it and the way that you prove it. And that's basically it for choosing the best response. So until next time, I'll see you later.